Kaivan, I may drop off video, but I'm here.
Okay. Okay, welcome everyone to the module on social networks and migration. My name is Kaivan Munshi, and the other panelists on this module will be Maria Esther Caballero and Josh Blumenstock. And the way that we're going to organize this is that I will speak for 40 minutes, giving you a sort of a brief overview of how I see this area of research. And that will be followed by a 20-minute presentation each from Maria Esther and Josh. And one way to think about this is that I'm kind of the old guy who's been around a long time, and I'm going to give you this sort of overview. And then the cutting edge research will follow, okay? So I think that might be the right way to think about this. So let me just jump right in. Right through this presentation, I'm going to be working with a very particular model of migration, which is in some sense the canonical model of migration in economics, often called the Roy model. This is a model in which an individual's location choice depends on the payoff at the origin, the payoff at the destination, and the cost of moving. And depending on the context, the payoffs will typically also depend on the individual's ability or education. Now, before I go any further, I just want to emphasize that when I think about migration, I don't just think about spatial mobility. I also think about occupational mobility. And in fact, these two are often very closely linked. You can use the Roy model to understand spatial movements. You can use the Roy model to understand occupational movements, or a combination of the two. Okay, so just keep that in mind as we go forward. So let's understand the Roy model a little bit more. And to do that, let's denote individual ability by omega. Let the payoff at the origin be omega to the power of a parameter sigma. And let the payoff at the destination be a parameter A0 multiplied by omega, where you can think of A0 as in some sense reflecting the opportunities at the destination. Now, the other thing to note is that once you have ability heterogeneity, that's going to allow you to sort of, select people or sort people on that dimension. And then you don't need moving costs. So in general, if you have some notion, some type of, ability heterogeneity, you can shut down the moving costs. If everybody is the same, you need something else to decide who's going to migrate and who's going to stay. And then you do need moving costs. For our purpose now, we can just ignore the moving costs. And now what's easy to see is that if sigma is less than 1, then there's going to be positive selection on ability. And there will be an ability threshold above which individuals migrate. If sigma is greater than 1, then there will be negative selection on ability, and individuals below a particular threshold will migrate. In addition, an exogenous increase in A0 will shift down the threshold and increase migration. And in a sense, in a nutshell, this really describes the functioning of the Roy model. And it's very simple, but as you will see, it has a lot of power. It really is a very useful way of thinking about the migration decision. Now, how well does the Roy model explain, stylized facts that have been observed on migration? One moment. The first thing is that variation in A0 measured by the wage gap measures only a small part of the migration flows that have been observed between countries. What seems to matter more for bilateral flows is the existing stock of migrants. The second stylized fact is that depending on the context, migrants from Mexico to the US seem to be drawn from very different parts of the ability distribution. Sometimes you observe positive selection on ability, sometimes you observe negative selection, sometimes they're drawn from the middle of the distribution. And then finally, if you look within a community, an origin community over time, what you observe, as documented by McKenzie and Rappaport, is that initially there is positive selection, which is then later followed by negative selection. And the point is that the very simple model that I described for you earlier cannot explain these three stylized facts. Now, it is possible to augment the Roy model to explain the stylized facts. So for example, what you could do is, what you could do is to say that, hey, maybe what matters for migration is proximity. And we don't observe proximity. And so the stock of migrants at a particular destination is just proxying for unobserved proximity. And that's what you're really picking up. Alternatively, you could imagine that this A0 parameter is just changing over time. It's getting larger and larger. And as a result, this ability threshold is decreasing. And as initially you have positive selection, and then later on you have negative selection. So there's a way of actually, extending this Roy model in different dimensions to explain the stylized fact. But the point I want to make is that a very simple extension of this model, which allows for networks at the destination, can explain all of these stylized facts. And what do these networks do? Well, these networks would provide job referrals, mutual insurance, different forms of support. And apart from parsimony, the additional advantage of this extension is that it is supported by a wealth of anecdotal evidence from different parts of the world, that in fact, when migrants move, they would typically move with the support of origin networks. And if you're interested, there is a discussion of this in my review article in the Journal of Economic Perspectives. Okay, so now let's add networks to the Roy model. And the way we're going to do that is by replacing that A0 parameter with A0 multiplied by the exponent of theta multiplied by nt minus 1. Where nt minus 1 is the size of the network at the beginning of period t. Now, this specification should actually be familiar to many of you. This is really what you would often see in models of agglomeration and endogenous growth. But the important difference is that here, nt minus 1 is restricted to individuals from the same origin. Okay, now let's assume that log omega is distributed uniformly on the unit interval, and that the sigma parameter now is less than 1. This implies that there's going to be an ability threshold omega bar in period t, at which the individual is indifferent between moving and staying. Individuals with ability above omega bar will move, and those below omega bar will stay. And you can derive a very simple expression for omega bar. And notice here, as A0 increases and as nt minus 1 increases, omega bar goes down, the threshold decreases. And so what's happening here is that over time, as you have more and more entrants coming in and the network gets larger, the threshold keeps declining. So you have this negative selection over time, which is exactly what McKenzie and Rappaport document. Once you have people at a particular destination and NT keeps increasing, you're going to have more and more people moving there because the threshold keeps declining. So we can explain 2 of the 3 stylized facts. What about the other one, about the heterogeneity and the cross-section? Now, I have a paper on the Indian diamond industry where I describe the circumstances under which a network will actually take off. It turns out that you need to have a confluence of circumstances, of fortuitous confluence of favorable circumstances for something like this to happen. And this is why what you'll often find is that networks take off at very different points of time for different origin communities. What that also tells us is if you think about these Mexican origin communities, they would be at very different stages in their process of network development. And as a result, the type of selection that you would have across these communities at a particular point in time would be very different. And that would explain the heterogeneity in migrant selection that has been observed. And so the point is, as I said, is that this very simple extension to the Roy model can literally do what you want to explain the stylized facts. Now, much of the literature in economics and the other social sciences has focused on these destination networks when understanding the process of migration. But more recently, there has been a literature which also looks at networks at the origin. And the idea in these papers, and there's a paper here with Mark Rosenzweig in 2016, and Melanie Morton has a more recent paper. Both of these papers look at the role played by mutual insurance arrangements at the origin in shaping migration decisions. In the paper with Rosenzweig, what we do is we look at permanent migration, whereas what Melanie does is to look at temporary migration. And in my view, these are very different. With permanent migration, you're essentially exiting the network. With temporary migration, you remain part of the origin of the network, of your origin network. It's in some sense an extension of the origin network. Now, when you have permanent migration, the Roy model again applies, but now the network would be at the origin. And in this paper, what we have essentially is that as the network gets larger, its ability to smooth out consumption and provide mutual insurance increases. But at the same time, there is it's sort of an incentive for people to leave as well. And that will depend on their opportunities at the destination. So just as described above, now, instead of ability, there are going to be these opportunities at the destination. And there's a distribution of these opportunities. And so above some threshold opportunity, people are going to leave. And below that, they're going to stay and remain part of their network. Okay, but this, of course, becomes a complicated decision because that determines also the size of the network. So the threshold is going to be determined endogenously in equilibrium as a solution to a fixed point problem. All right, but the key point is that the Roy model, in some sense, that key workhorse model can always be applied. There's always some dimension along which people are sorting. There are payoffs at the origin, there are payoffs at the destination, and depending on the context, you can add the network either at the origin or at the destination. So now what I want to do is to talk about something else, which is the identification of network effects. Okay, let's go back again to our Roy model. Remember, we derived this expression for the threshold ability omega bar. And what we said was that log of omega bar was distributed uniformly on the unit interval. So the number of entrants in period t will be 1 minus omega bar. And that can be derived as this linear function, which we have over here. And as I said earlier, as A0 increases and as NT minus 1 increases, the threshold goes down. And as a result, the level of entry goes up. Now, could we really estimate this equation? Well, evidently not, because the threat to identification here is that any unobserved serially correlated shock at the destination would generate a spurious correlation between ET and NT minus 1. And this is why you never want to run this regression. You don't want to ever look at the relationship between the number of entrants at a particular point in time and the stock of migrants. Okay, because there could be unobserved heterogeneity that is just driving this particular relationship. So what you need, if you really want to estimate this network effect, is some kind of shock at the origin. And this is what I use in my paper on Mexican migrants to the US, where I use rainfall shocks in the Mexican origin communities as instruments for changes in NT minus 1. And what I do is to replace entry as a dependent variable with other labor market outcomes, like employment or the type of occupation. Okay, now what Maria Esther is going to do in the paper that she presents is to look at, it is to examine the effect of destination shocks on migrant origins. Okay, in my case, I was looking at shocks at the origin and looking at the effect of that on outcomes at the destination. She does the reverse. But in general, if you really want to do this correctly, you need to be searching for these kinds of exogenous shocks. And her presentation will give you a good example of sort of cutting edge research that does this kind of thing. The problem is that there are many environments in which valid instruments will be unavailable. And I just want to emphasize that you don't want to ever use fixed characteristics as instruments. Even if they are exogenous, they will typically not be valid instruments because they will typically determine the outcome through other channels as well. So there is, for example, some previous research which uses historical access to the railroad as an instrument for subsequent migration. And it certainly would determine the migration. But then that access to the railroad would also determine population characteristics, which would have then had a direct impact on migration decisions and outcomes independently of the network. Now, you can use these exogenous fixed characteristics, but not to estimate network effects. What you can do is what I would like to talk about next, which is to use these exogenous characteristics in a model-based approach to actually look at migration. Now, this is a very different style of research. where you're going to start off with a theoretical model of migration, typically based in some way or the other around the Moroi model that will incorporate networks. And now the key is to identify an exogenous source of variation within that model. This could be based on heterogeneity across cohorts within the network, as for example, used by Laurie Beeman in her paper on refugees in the United States, or it could be based on heterogeneity in the origin. This could be with respect to outside options, which is what I use in my paper on the Indian diamond industry, or it could be based on heterogeneity in social networks in the origin population, which is what I use in a paper on Chinese firms, which I'm going to describe later on as well. And in all of these cases, what you're using is some kind of exogenous variation that can be then linked to this model that you're working with. And what you want to do is to derive the relationship between that exogenous source of variation and outcomes like migrant flows, migrant selection, and destination outcomes. And then you want to actually test those implications. Just to be clear, this exogenous source of variation is not going to be an instrument. So there's always going to be the possibility that it affects these outcomes through other channels that have nothing to do with the networks. And so the key is that if you can derive a sufficiently rich set of implications, you can use those implications to rule out alternative non-network explanations or mechanisms. Okay, so in some sense, this is an indirect approach. It's a very model-based approach, but you're still taking the empiric seriously by trying to find some source of exogenous variation. Now, this is indirect. The network is kind of sitting around in the middle of the story, but you don't directly observe it. And so what you really want to do with this kind of approach is at the very end, you want to get some direct evidence that these networks are actually active. But here, what you'd want to do is to show that these measures, whatever measures you get of the network, are associated with this exogenous source of variation. So they will be on the left-hand side of your estimating equation. You will not be directly estimating network effects, which is what I was doing in my Mexican migration paper, or what, for example, something like what Maria Esther would be doing. Okay, just to be clear about the difference in this approach. Now, let me give you an example, which I think might help you understand how you can use this sort of model-based approach. So this is an example that's looking at structural change in China. Now, the transition from agriculture to industry is, as we all know, the point of departure for modern economic development. The shift from domestic production to exporting is a subsequent key transition. And the question that we ask in this project, and this is work in progress, we don't even have a paper just yet, is what role did networks play in these two transitions, key transitions in China? What we do in this project is to focus on entrepreneurship, which is, as we all know, essential to structural change. And just to give you some context, Chinese sort of economic development really commences with privatization in the early 1990s, after which there was a huge increase in the number of private firms. And then about a decade later, in the early 2000s, China started to export in a big way. And that is the second transition. And what we want to do in this project is to examine the role played by networks in these transitions. But let's talk a little bit first about entrepreneurship in China. So a distinguishing feature of Chinese economic development is that it was relatively broad-based. So in this analysis, we have access to administrative data covering the universe of registered firms, starting from the 1980s all the way through over time. And what's nice about these data is that you actually know the birth county of these entrepreneurs, of all of these entrepreneurs. So even though most of these firms are established outside of the birth county, we know where these people are from. And what you find is that 2/3 of registered firms were established by entrepreneurs who were born in rural counties. Now, there are 2,000 of these counties, and the first question to ask before I even think about networks is which counties were better positioned to support entrepreneurship. And one view would be that historical advantage in the pre-modern economy prior to industrialization, associated with greater agricultural productivity, would have provided the wealth, education, and connections that are needed to start a business. A second view would be that historical scarcity gives rise to an entrepreneurial culture. And we're agnostic about this. What we want to do is to just see what it is in China. And so the way that we measure historical agricultural productivity is by using pre-industrial population density, measured in 1982, prior to privatization in the 1990s. And here we're going to use only that part of the variation in population density that can be explained by exogenous crop suitability obtained from the FAO database. Okay, so what do we find? So the first thing we find is that the propensity to become an entrepreneur is increasing in birth county population density more steeply over time. Okay, so let me show you patterns of entry. So on the x-axis, what you have is the population density of the birth county. And on the y-axis, you have the number of entering firms over 4 time periods: 1994 to 1997, 98 to 2001, 2002 to 2005, and 2006 to 2009. This is entry, okay, not the stock of firms. And the thing you notice here is that entry is always increasing in population density. It's increasing over time, and it's increasing more steeply over time in population density. This is a very striking finding. This is telling us that there is explosive growth in the number of firms because entry is increasing over time. Okay, now you might say that this result just is mechanical because with higher population density, you have a larger population. There are just more people who are available to become entrepreneurs. So a second way to look at this would be to actually look at the propensity to become an entrepreneur, which we measure by the number of entrepreneurs from a given birth county divided by the total number of potential entrepreneurs, which is men between the age of 25 and 60. Okay, so this controls for the population, for example. And we regress this propensity to become an entrepreneur on the population density. And what I'm reporting for you here is the coefficient on that population density coefficient, on the population density at each point in time. Okay, the blue circle, and of course the vertical line is the 95% confidence interval. So the first thing to note is that these coefficients are always positive, okay, and that they're getting bigger over time. Now, the blue circle is a coefficient that you have when you're just regressing on population density itself. The red diamond is the coefficient that you have when you're only using that part of the variation in population density that can be explained by the crop suitability. And then finally, the green square is the coefficient that you have when you also include certain key control variables, which are changing over time, which including, for example, education in the origin population, the occupational structure in the origin county, etc. And when you put in these control variables and when you control for the crop suitability, you do see that the relationship gets weaker, but it still remains very strong and it's increasing over time. So clearly there's something else out there which is unexplained, which is giving these firms from these higher population density counties a boost. And this is increasing over time. Okay, the next thing we're going to look at is a propensity to become an export. And here you see a very different picture. What we have here on the y-axis is the fraction of firms who actually move in, who also do exporting. And what you see here is no relationship. It's increasing over time, but there's no relationship with population density. Now, you might say that this is just mechanical again, because we just saw that the number of domestic firms is increasing very steeply with population density. So of course, your denominator is very large. And so as a result, even though the number of exporters is increasing, it's just increasing at the same rate. So let's look at it another way. Let's use the propensity measure, just like we did earlier. So now what we have is the number of exporters divided by the total number of potential entrepreneurs. It's the same denominator as we had earlier. And now what you find is that once you control for the crop suitability, and once you include the same control variables as before, you get essentially no relationship between export propensity and population density. You do start to see an increase at the very end, but clearly for a decade, there seems to be nothing happening at all with respect to population density. And now you might say to yourself, I know the answer to this. It's pretty obvious. Basically, these firms from high population density counties, they just happen to have local connections for whatever reason with government officials that allows them to go into local business, domestic production, but they don't have any comparative advantage when it comes to exporting. And to look at that, we should look at the outcomes of these firms, at the performance of these firms. And what we do here is we look at the revenue of these firms over time. So we're including firm fixed effects in all of these regressions. And we're seeing how the revenue of these firms is changing over time with respect to population density. And if you look at column 1 and column 3, what you find is that the coefficient on the birth county population density variable interacted with time is positive and significant, both for domestic revenue as well as for export revenues. Moreover, the coefficient on export revenues is larger than the coefficient on domestic revenues. So it's not as if these firms from high population density counties don't do well when they go into exporting. They do, if anything, they do better in exporting than they do in domestic production. Now, you might think to yourself, well, one reason why this is happening is because these firms just happen to have access to, fortuitously to particular sectors or locations which are just growing fast for other reasons. So what we do in columns 4 to 6 is to control for that. What we do is we look within the sector location where firms are established. And what we do is we find the rank for these firms among all the firms in that sector location with respect to revenue at each point in time. And then we see how this rank is changing over time for firms from different origin counties. And you get exactly the same result. Within a sector location, firms from higher population density counties are growing faster. This is true for domestic production, and it is true for export revenue. And so there is some force that is at work that is giving these firms a boost. Okay, and what we want to do now, the next step, is to explain these stylized facts. And to do that, we want to fall back on our old friend, the Roy model. Okay, now think about the decision about becoming an entrepreneur or about becoming an exporter. Let's start off with just the decision about becoming an entrepreneur. This is going to depend on opportunities in the traditional occupation that this person might have access to in agriculture or in wage labor. It will depend on this person's opportunities in business separately for domestic production and exporting. And then finally, it will depend on the individual's resources, which includes ability, education, and wealth. And to be consistent with the preceding discussion of the Roy model, I'm going to think about all of this in some sense as the individual's ability. Okay, that's the variable among which individuals will be selecting or sorting. Now, when you think about opportunities in business, we can be completely general here. This could be access to technology, infrastructure, connections, spillovers, market size, prices, and all of these things could vary across birth counties and over time. Okay, so we want to have a model. As I said, the Roy model, despite its simplicity, is really good at thinking about these decisions. This can be, you can make this as general as you want it to be. And now let's ask ourselves, which component of the Roy model can explain these stylized facts? So let's start off with the first stylized fact, which was that the entry of firms is increasing in population density more steeply over time. Now, it turns out that all of these factors can explain this. Think about origin opportunities. Imagine a world in which higher population density counties actually have worse opportunities in their origin location, perhaps because of population pressures. So what that means in the context of the Roy model is that that ability threshold is going to be lower in higher population density counties. And if this is getting worse and worse over time, that threshold is going to decrease more steeply in higher population density counties as well. And that would increase the number of entrants. And you would get exactly what we observed in the first fact. Alternatively, think about a world in which higher population density counties, the population just has an ability distribution that is shifted to the right. And this advantage keeps increasing over time. Now the ability threshold is the same for everyone, but you have more people who have crossed the threshold in the higher population density counties. And this again is increasing over time to explain the first fact. And then finally, you could tell a story where in fact opportunities at the destination in business are different for whatever reason. Okay, now there again, you would get that the threshold will be lower for the higher population density counties because now lower ability individuals would be willing to move into business because they get some other boost for other reasons, because they have better opportunities in business. And this is increasing over time. This would also explain the first stylized fact. The real puzzle for us, and this is why you want to typically think about these stylized facts in this way, the real puzzle for us is why entrepreneurs from higher population density counties do not display a greater propensity to export, despite the fact that export revenues are growing faster than domestic revenues with respect to population density. Now, just to be clear, if it was a story about the origin opportunities, and the fact that, for example, these opportunities were worse for higher population density counties and then getting worse and worse and worse over time, this would explain, for example, why these firms would be more likely, why would see more entrepreneurs from those particular counties. That's the first stylized fact, as I said. It would also explain why there's no effect on exporting, because that's another higher ability threshold, which is not affected by this decision. But it would not explain the third fact. It would not explain why firms from those counties do better once they go into business. Now think about the alternative, where in fact the story is based on the fact that the ability distribution is just shifted to the right in higher population density counties. That would explain the third stylized fact as well, potential, even though we have firm fixed effects, so it's not going to be that easy too. But in principle, you could tell a story where you could explain the third fact about the revenues. But it would not explain the second stylized, because if these populations just have higher ability, then they will be more likely to move into business and they will be more likely to move into exporting. So by a process of elimination, what we're left with now is the third story, that there must be variation in business opportunities across these birth counties and over time to explain this. Now, if you look at the revenue results, these firms from higher population density counties, their revenues could be increasing more steeply over time, either because of an experience effect or a time effect. That's a very well-known result when you have firm fixed effects. But it can't be an experience effect, because if that were true, you wouldn't see the first fact. You wouldn't see the entry of firms coming in. So there must be a time effect. There is something going on which is giving firms within particular sector locations from higher population density counties some kind of boost, both in exports as well as in domestic production. And as I said, by a process of elimination, we are left with a story about the networks. Now, there is actually some support for such a story. There is a pre-existing literature on networks in China, which argues that networks supporting migration, business, and other economic activities have been organized historically and continue to be organized around the home place or the birth county. Now, the story here would be that firms from each birth county provide mutual support to each other separately in domestic production and exporting. This could be, for example, productive support, for example, connections, information, etc., or it could just be rent seeking. They help each other get connections to government officials, etc. And we're agnostic about this. The point is that there is a way of thinking about this in the context of pre-existing networks. But the problem, what we would need then is to explain also why it is the case that the networks seem to be functioning better for firms from these higher population density counties. Okay, so now what we need to do is to explain the stylized fact with this alternative story. We've already explained the first fact, I mean, that for sure. We can explain the third fact for the revenues because that's just mechanical. The network is basically within a sector location, giving these firms a boost. And the network is getting stronger over time, just as we saw with the Roy model. But what you need to also explain the second stylized fact. That's the killer, that's the hard one. Why is it the case that you don't see this propensity to go into exporting? Now, in the Melitz model, which is kind of the workhorse model in trade economics, the story here would be that if firms can go into business, then above some ability threshold, they will also go into exporting. Right? That would be the story, for example. And now there will be no tension between the domestic network and the export network. The exporting firms will be part of the domestic network and they will be part of the export network. The important thing for our purpose is that in the Chinese data, there is a non-trivial fraction of what we call pure exporters. And these are intermediate firms. So you have lots and lots of smaller domestic firms. We have very large mixed firms who do domestic production and exporting. And then you have these pure exporters who are intermediate. And it turns out that these are the people who are in some sense the marginal firms who determine the propensity to export. And these firms have to make a choice between the domestic network and the export network. Now, when you think about it in the context of the Roy model, again, that theta parameter is going to be larger in exporting than in domestic production. But the number of firms, the NT-1, is way larger in the domestic network than in the export network. And remember that domestic network was in place for 10 years before the export network started. So there is this overhang, which basically discourages these pure exporters, firms from becoming pure exporters. And that is the intuition that we have. Now, of course, this is just an intuition. What you really have to do is to develop a model that incorporates this competition between the domestic and the export network, and then show that it can explain the stylized facts. Now, once you've done that, you still need to go further. You need to derive additional implications from this model for selection into business, for the concentration of activity in particular sectors and locations, both for domestic production as well as for exporting, as well as the nature of exporting, the share of mixed versus pure exporters across birth counties as well as over time. And we need to check that this actually matches with the data to validate this part. Now, once you've done that, you can then go ahead and estimate the structural parameters of this model. And this serves two purposes. One is it allows us to test particular parametric assumptions. As I said, what we're going to need here is this idea that theta is actually larger in exports than in domestic production. But that's just an assumption. When we estimate the structural model, we can see whether this is true or not. And then once the structural model is estimated, we can do all sorts of interesting counterfactuals as well. And then finally, as I said, the important thing is you want to validate the underlying network mechanism. And the way you want to do that here in our case, of course, is that we have actually lots of information about the key individuals in each of these firms. And in particular, we know where they are born. So what we can show is that firms are located outside of their birth county. They still stay connected to their birth county. And they're very likely to have key individuals from that same birth county. This is increasing in birth county population density. Firms are also linked to other firms in the prefecture or the locations where they are established. And these links are disproportionately with firms from the same birth county. And once again, this is increasing in birth county population density. And then finally, we look at a particular network statistic proposed by Jackson and his co-authors, which is associated with the level of cooperation that can be supported in a network. And Josh, I think, will talk about this in his presentation as well. It's called support. And what we find is that the support in these business networks is increasing once again in birth county population density. So that is a way in which you want to take a model-based approach to think about migration. Now, I have a few minutes left in which I will talk about directions for future research. The first thing I want to emphasize is that, yes, it's important to estimate network effects. And you need to establish that, in fact, these networks really do exist, and they actually do play a role in the economy. But incorporating them in models of migration only makes sense if they make a first-order contribution to outcomes and to migration decisions. And to establish that, you really need quantification. And for quantification, you need to estimate a structural model. So my the one thing I would like to say is that we need to move beyond just identification and think about the migration decision within the context of a model, typically, as I said, the Roy model with networks, and then think about structural estimation. This will also shed light, for example, on the inefficiencies that are associated with the existence of these networks. In the Chinese case, for example, in those birth counties where you have stronger networks, you're going to have weaker people coming in at the margin. That's a misallocation. You'd like to actually have higher ability people from other counties coming into business if they could. And then, of course, there will be unintended spillovers from programs which can be evaluated through the lens of these models. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is assimilation. And this, again, is an area that I think is really, really important and is understudied. At the end of the day, we've been talking a lot about network formation, but at the end of the day, these networks will decay. Networks arise fundamentally because there are imperfections in the market. And once markets start to function efficiently in developing economies, these networks will disappear. Similarly, with international migration, the reason why these networks are so important is because these migrants don't have access to the market economy in their host economies. At the end of the day, once they assimilate, these networks will become less. And there will be resulting dynamics of network decay, which will mirror the process of network formation. And Mark Rosenzweig and I have a paper on labor markets in Bombay City where we describe this process, which is almost the reverse, where higher ability people will exit the network first, and then over time, that threshold is going to keep decreasing, and more people are going to leave. But a very important part of this process of network decay is to think about identity. Once networks are established, once these communities have been in place for a long time, they will instill in their members a particular identity. And we know very little about how such identity forms, how it evolves, and in particular, how it is shaped by interactions with other groups, as well as with the state over time. And to me, this is a really important area for research. It's very topical. And this is, of course, a multi-generational process. So theoretically, understanding this is challenging. Empirically, it's perhaps even more challenging because you will need data over long periods of time to understand this process. But that said, we shouldn't be scared away by it because this is super important. And then finally, I want to talk about the network architecture. Now, up to this point, the implicit assumption has been that individuals match randomly within the network. And this is why essentially the size of the network is a relevant statistic for the analysis. But once you relax this assumption, then the network architecture becomes relevant. And this is what Josh is going to be talking about, okay? But this, of course, then the challenge, again, as with assimilation, when you go forward in this way, it gets also more challenging. The identification problem is going to be more challenging. And he'll show you how you can creatively address this. And of course, the data requirements are formidable. Now you need to understand the links within the network as well. And so you need very special data to do this. Okay, but what I would like to end by saying is don't be scared by the challenge. Be ambitious. Even if you don't get things perfectly, it's much better to ask important and big questions than to focus on small questions. Okay, so let me stop over here and I will turn it over to Maria Esther, who can then take over.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. Let me just share my screen. Imagine to stop sharing the screen so I can share mine. Okay. Perfect. Well, thank you so much for the introduction. And actually, as Kaivan said before, this paper is super related to the lecture, as it shows the role of the migrant network in transmitting economic shocks from migrant destinations to their origin communities. And this is a joint work with Brian Kaivan from CU Boulder and Brian Kovac from Carnegie Mellon University. So when we think of the integration of economies around the world, we usually think of international trade and capital flows as the key drivers of this integration. Now, international migration might be another channel through which this integration, especially of international labor markets, occur. But this channel has been less studied, at least in a contemporaneous context, because of the lack of data connecting migrant sources and destinations. So in this project, what we do is to use new data to study how the migrant network transmits economic shocks across the US-Mexico border. Now, from the previous lectures and from the literature, we know that migrants tend to cluster in locations when where there are large co-ethnic populations when they arrive to their destinations. And these clusters or networks that they create increase the migration probability from the same origin, as Kaivan was mentioning before, because they provide information, they help with the settlement process, and they provide job referrals. We also know that the location choices of migrants are sensitive to destination labor demand. And so given these facts, we expect that changes in destination labor demand lead to changes in migration patterns and remittances, which in turn is going to have effects on other outcomes in migrant source locations, which is very related to the research that last week lecture was mentioned. So the specific question that we ask here is what happens in migrant sending communities when they lose access, or migrants lose access to strong foreign labor markets. And to answer this question, we are going to use geographic variation in employment declines across US labor markets due to the Great Recession. So this is the exogenous, one of the exogenous shocks that we are going to use. And we use new data to construct migrant networks at the subnational level between Mexico and the US. And we focus on the Mexico-US case because Mexican migrants are the biggest migrant group in the US. They represent 30% of all US immigrants. And because of the geographic detail that we have in our data that allows us to observe within country and to have a within state research design. So our approach compares changes in outcomes for each Mexican source community or region that is connected through the migrant network to US destinations that face different labor demand shocks. Now, our research or results are related to two different strands of the literature. The first strand that shows that international migration responds to destination labor demand. And specifically, we add to this empirical work that has shown that Mexican migrants reallocate within the US when they face declines in labor demand. So we additionally show that they also respond to these declines in labor demand by moving back home. The other strand of the literature that our research relates to is all this literature showing that changes in destination labor demand have effects on different outcomes in migrant sending communities. So our results are consistent with prior work showing effects on occupational choices, entrepreneurship, and education. And we further contribute to this literature by having finer geographic detail and complete geographic coverage in Mexico by using new data and gold standard survey and administrative data, and by having a within Mexican state design that allows for a stronger identification of these effects. Now, our research design requires to be able to observe variation in US labor demand for potential migrants from different sources or communities in Mexico. So in the paper, we developed a simple location choice model that shows us how to use two different sources of variation in order to have identified these effects. So the first source of variation that we use is this network connection between each source in Mexico and each destination in the US. And the way that we measure that network is just the share of migrants from each specific region in Mexico living in each US destination. Now, measuring this is really hard. And that is because most data sets available only provide subnational geographic information in one of the countries. So for instance, the American Community Survey, which is a survey that is developed in the US, only provide information on the place where migrants live in the US, but we only know that they are from Mexico. So we only know their nationality. On the other hand, the Mexican census provide information on the place of origin of the migrants, of course, the immigrants, but we only see that they went to live to the US, but not where in the US. So there are other specialized data sets that do provide information, both sources and destinations in the US and in Mexico, but that have limitations for our research design. So for instance, the Mexican Migration Project, which is a great resource to follow migrants over time, only covers a small set of communities in Mexico. The ENADIT and EMIF, which are surveys from Mexico, provides information at the state level, both in Mexico and the US. All of them have a small sample size. And in the case of the MEF, it provides information on the intended migration rather than the actual migration. So given these limitations, what we do is to use data, this great resource, which is data from the Matrícula Consular de Alta Seguridad, which is this identity card that you observe here, that is issued to Mexicans living in the US. And these card holders are mostly assumed to be unauthorized Mexican migrants. And this is because these cards do not provide any migration status. It's just used as an official form of identification in the US to do things like opening bank accounts, and in some states, get driver's license. And it is valid for 5 years. So this is one great resource that is coming from administrative data that we use to measure the migrant network. Sorry. So with some of the information on this card, the Mexican government made available tabulations on the counts of the cars by year, Mexican place of birth, and US place of residence. And for this project in particular, we have a customized version of the data that allows us to observe the municipio or municipality of birth in Mexico and county of residence in the US, which is important for our case because that allows us to measure US employment declines or shocks at the local labor market level. So with this data, we are able to observe connections from to different US labor markets for each Mexican source region. And here in these maps, you can see an example of the type of variation that we have using this data set, in the network using this data set. So this map shows the destination distribution of 2 Mexican municipalities located in the state of Guanajuato in Mexico, so here. So you see that they are very close to each other, and in fact, they are like 3 hours apart by car, and yet they tend to send migrants to very different places in the US. So for instance, migrants from Dolores Hidalgo tend to locate, most of them, in places in Texas, whereas migrants from Jaral del Progreso tend to locate in Southern California and in Nevada. So this variation in the destination distribution is one of the sources of variation that we used in our analysis. So the second source of variation that we use in our design is variation in employment declines across US labor markets that are defined as commuting zones during the Great Recession. So here in this map, you can see that here what we are showing is changes in employment from 2006 to 2010 across commuting zones in the US. So here, places in dark blue are places that face larger employment declines. And you can see that there are a lot of variation, geographic variation on that. And what this means for our design is that if a municipality in Mexico is connected to, let's say, places in Texas or labor markets in Texas, they're gonna face a smaller declines in employment than a municipality that is connected to places in Southern California. Okay, so now combining the 2 sources of variation that I just showed you and following our location choice model, we derive this labor demand shock that faced each Mexican source municipality, which is our main independent variable. And here you can think of it as a weighted average of employment declines, where one of the weights here is just the migrant network. So the share of Mexican migrants from each source living in each destination in 2006, so before the Great Recession. And here what we have is just the proportional change in employment across industries and destinations in the US before and after the Great Recession, so from 2006 to 2010. And we further weight these declines in employment by the share of Mexican-born workers in each industry and commuting zone in the US, just to take into account the fact that Mexican migrants tend to work in very specific industries. And we use county business pattern and American Community Survey data to get employment and some demographic characteristics on Mexican workers in the US. Now, here what you can see is the variations or the US employment shock across Mexican municipalities and places, again, places in dark blue, just are municipios facing larger employment declines. And you see that, you know, this is the variation that we finally use in our analysis. Now, our estimating equation that it is also derived from our location choice model relates changes in a specific outcome at the Mexican municipality level to our US employment shock measure, which is here. And again, the unit of analysis is a municipality in Mexico. In delta YS represents the long difference in a specific outcome at the Mexican municipality. We also include this share of people that is actually living in the US, and we call that measure exposure. And we include Mexican state fixed effects, and we include controls for changes in sources and destination characteristics. And to measure our outcomes, we use Mexican population census to measure most of the demographic and other outcomes. And for the labor market outcomes, we use data from the economic census in Mexico as well. So what do we find? So what we find is that actually there were changes in migration patterns and remittances. So here in this table, each column represents a different outcome. And if we focus on first column, we see this negative coefficient. And what this is telling us is that a municipio that faced larger employment declines experience faster population growth. Then we also measure effects on return migration and immigration, so columns 2 and 3. And again, you see this negative coefficient that tells us that in these municipios that face worse shocks, return migration increased. And the positive coefficient for immigration tells us that immigration decline more in these municipios relative to those facing smaller shocks. And finally, we also see effects on remittances. So here, what we measure is the share of households receiving remittances, and we see that in these municipios or municipalities, the share of remittances or the share of households, receiving remittances also decline. So we also look at other outcomes, so local labor market outcomes. And here what you can see is the employment to population ratio separately for male and females, and also earning per hours or wages. And you see here that in all cases, the coefficients are negative, but the only one that is significant is this one on female employment. And what this means is that these municipios facing worse employment shocks, there was a larger growth in female employment. So we interpret this as a worker added effect, where female or many of the women have to go into the labor market in response to this shock. So additional results, we further or perform a cross-sectional analysis to further support our labor market results, because we assume there that that is an analysis at the regional level, and we assume that those results were coming for households that had a migrant in the US. And so with this cross-sectional analysis, we actually show evidence that that is the case. So we see that the employment differences are coming from households that are exposed or that have relatives in the US. We also look at other outcomes such as female to male sex ratio. So we do see that more men came back from the US, and this is because most of the migrants to the US from Mexico to the US are men. We do not find changes in the education distribution of the population in Mexico. And we also look at some outcomes on investments. So we see that, for instance, purchases of appliances slowed, and school enrollment for primary school ages fell somewhat. So this is just an effect of this decline in remittances that we observed. So to conclude, the Great Recession moved migrants back to Mexico, which in turn increased the population, particularly of men, in many of these sending areas. Remittances fell, and these changes in population and capital flows had important consequences for these sending communities. And overall, these we show that these migrant networks actually integrate local labor markets across international borders, and that losing access to strong labor markets has consequences or has these spillover effects beyond the US borders. And these results could inform the policy discussions on limiting migrants' access to foreign labor markets. So, thank you.
So Josh, I guess you'll take it over now.
Great. Thanks, Kaivan. Let me just share my screen. Good. I assume you're all seeing my slides, and if not, someone will say something. So I'm going to talk about a paper that's joint with Guanghua Qi, who was a PhD student at Berkeley at the time and is now at Facebook, which is now Meta, and Xu Tan, who's an economist at the University of Washington. And so what this paper is about is trying to say something about how networks, social networks, influence the decision to migrate. So this is, a question that Kaivan provided really great background on, and also a lot more detail than I'll really get into. But what we try and do is focus on disentangling between two, stylized narratives about how migrants might benefit from social networks. The first being that networks can provide access to new sources of information, for instance, about jobs or opportunities in the destination, amenities, and the like. And the second is that, again, some of Kaivan's recent work, as well as other speakers in this module on migration, have discussed is how networks can facilitate risk sharing, provide access to social support and solidarity networks, and the like. Again, both of these ideas have a rich tradition in the literature. And while, with 20 minutes, I'm not really going to get into the details of our model, sort of conceptually, of how we think about the way that network provide this sort of utility. At a very stylized level, you can think that there are fundamentally different network structures, like social network configurations, that facilitate these two sources of value. And what you see, particularly in the network theory literature, is that the sort of networks that facilitate access to information are very, and we call it expansive. Basically, these sort of star-shaped networks where a person is central and their connections have lots of connections. And that's a very different sort of structure than is optimal for risk sharing and social support, where what you see there are, and Kaivan mentioned this particular measure, which is called network support, but also ideas like network clustering. These more triangle interconnected networks are the ones that are better for allowing for social reinforcement and sanctioning that are thought to be essential for efficient risk sharing. So, what we're going to do is try and contrast these two different types of network structure in a model and then empirically test it using new data. So, but before getting into that, I think, the question we're interested in, how do networks influence the decision to migrate? It's worth pointing out, and again, Kaivan highlighted this as well, that part of the reason this is a difficult question is that it's hard to study the relationship between networks and migration using traditional methods and traditional data. And so what we do is really three things. So first, show how new sources of data can facilitate the study of A, social networks, and B, migration, but C, really, and what the paper is about, is how the two interact. And what I'll do today is focus on the second bullet point, which is to try and establish a more nuanced set of stylized facts about how network structure relates to migration decisions. And what I won't really have time for, but is a lot of the meat of the paper, is providing a little bit more structural insight into how social networks provide social capital. So in the paper, there's a model, and then we structurally estimate the model. But just in the interest of time, I want to just convey some of the intuition. Okay, so let me dive in. The data set that we're going to use that really enables this sort of analysis is the data set of mobile phone records, or referred to as call detail records. And here's an example of a single call detail record in this table here. So it's not the contents of a text message or the transcript of a phone call or anything like that. But the idea is anytime one person makes a call or sends a text message to another person, the time and date of that call is logged, and the approximate locations of the two subscribers at the time of the call are also logged. Basically, the cell tower identifiers through which the call is routed are recorded by the mobile phone company. And so what we do is we obtain a very large data set of these call detail records, covering a 5-year period in Rwanda. And here's a map of Rwanda on the left. You can see each of these dots is a cell phone tower. And so what the data allow us to do is roughly place each person at the time that they make a call. And by roughly, I mean within a few kilometers in rural areas, and then within a few hundred meters in urban areas. So, we have this data set. There's really two important things that we can observe in the data set. The first is social network structure. So because we observe who is talking to who, we observe, one revealed preference version of the social network. Now, there are a lot of caveats here, sources of measurement error, potential bias. We talk about those in the paper, but the idea is if people's phone call network is a reasonable reflection of their face-to-face network, especially over long distances, because we're going to be looking at inter-district migration, then this is a very rich source of information. So just to sort of show you what this is an example of, one single individual social network is observed over a couple months of phone calls. So in this figure, this is the individual focal individual eye, and then all of the red dots are the contacts that we observe that person has in outside. So this is an actual migrant, I should have said. And we're looking at the calls that the person made in the month prior to migrating. So the red dots are the people that person called in the eventual destination district. The blue dots are the people that person called in their home district. And then the gray dots are sort of all the other people they called, neither in home nor destination. And then the smaller dots are the friends of friends. And so what we're going to look at is a lot of this higher order network structure. But okay, so the first thing we observed is social network structure. The second thing we can observe is the locations that people occupy over time. And so what this video is showing you, I'm not sure how well it comes through on Zoom. So each frame in the video is a day in the life of this one person's mobile phone activity. And we're just highlighting the flashing white dots are the cell phone towers that person is using. And then the red dot is our best guess of their location on a particular day. And I chose this individual because they have a very clear sort of almost commuting-like pattern, although this is a couple hundred kilometers, so they're not commuting, but frequent trips between the two regions. And then eventually the person sort of ends up moving and remains stable here in this location for the next year or so. Okay, so when we have the raw location data, this is just another way of looking at the location data. And I'm belaboring the data because I think probably the biggest takeaway from this 20-minute section is to have you think a little bit more about how new sources of data can allow you to A, study migration, and B, potentially study social networks. So what we're doing here is I'm just showing you, this is one person's data, again, over time. So each of these is a different day, and then each of the rows is a different district. So Rwanda has 30 districts, and I'm just highlighting for you here the different districts in which this individual is observed over time. And so behind the scenes, what we have is an algorithm that allows us to roughly impute a person's home location at each day in the data set. And from that, we can then measure migration. Again, I'm skimming over the details, and we can come back to this in the Q&A if people are interested. But essentially what we're going to do is we're going to call a migrant someone who we observe to be in one district for at least K months, and then another district for the next K months. So in this example, K equals 3. So this is a migrant who first lived in Kigali and then lived in Huye. This is a non-migrant because they were in the same district continuously for 2K months. And then this is someone who would be neither a migrant nor a non-migrant because they were in Kigali continuously and then they moved around a little bit. So about 15% of observations fall into this class, and I want to say about 4% of observations fall into this class, and the remainder look like this. Okay, so that's in the data. Again, it's about 4 years of data from the country of Rwanda. And the central question we're going to try and ask is, or we'll ask it and we'll try and answer it, is acknowledging that many factors influence the migrant's decision to migrate. But what we're going to try and do, and I'll talk about this in a little bit of detail, is to the extent that we can hold all those other factors fixed, like wages and amenity differentials and so forth, distance, travel costs, and so forth, does the person A with a particular social network G not more likely to migrate than a person B who has a different social network? And so here's the stylized representation, where on the left we have migrant A, on the right we have migrant B. Here is the migrant, here is their connections in the home network, and here is their connections in the destination network, and up here are the connections of their connections. So note that these two migrants, or these two individuals, have almost identical social networks. They both have 3 friends at home, they both have 2 friends in the destination, and each of those contacts have 2 contacts each. The difference here is that migrant B, their friends are interconnected, right? That there's a connection between their 2 destination friends. And so we're going to say this minor variation in the higher order network structure, like the difference between A and B here, correspond with higher migration rates. And this is just one example, but of course we could say, okay, well, what about if the marginal variation is in the friends of friends in the destination? Or what about if the marginal variation is in the connections between friends at home, and so forth, okay? So just, again, stylized picture showing you what we can see in the data. There's no identification here. This is just descriptive. What I'm showing you is if we look across all of the data, so there's millions of individuals over, I think, about 90 months. What we're seeing, no, sorry, about 50 months. I'm showing you for each destination degree, in other words, each number of contacts, what the unconditional migration rate is. So when you look at this figure, what you should see is that amongst people who have exactly 10 contacts in a destination, roughly 4% of them eventually migrate to that destination. And there's some interesting stylized facts here already that doubling the number of destination contacts roughly corresponds to doubling the migration rate. The relationship is approximately linear. There's no curvature, as some prior work might imply, but of course there's no identification here. So how about identification? I don't want to spend too much time on it, especially because Kaivan said that we should stop worrying so much about identification and start thinking more about structure. He's on mute, so he can't disagree with me yet, but I'm sure he will later. But of course, what I showed you on the last slide was correlation. And so the question we're interested in is getting at the causal effect of networks on migration. And ideally, we'd want to randomly assign network structure and then look at subsequent migration decisions, but this is not something that we can do. And it's not something that's obvious there'd be a natural experiment. I think there's great work, including by Kaivan and others, and Ries, they're looking at how variation in prior migration rates might correlate with subsequent network. Anyways, I don't want to get into that too much because you've heard about it already. But what we're going to do is try and address the two main sources of endogeneity that we're worried about. And I'll fully acknowledge that our identification isn't airtight. That's partly why we have the structural model that I'm not going to talk about. But I do want to convince you that we can do a little bit to deal with endogeneity here. And so the first thing to worry about is basically reverse causality. The idea that when we observe high migration rates correlate with certain types of network structure, how do we know that it's not the migration that's causing the change in network structure? And so we do deal with this superficially by looking at lagged migration decisions. So we say, to what extent do migration decisions in, say, September correlate with migration decisions in December correlate with network structure in September? And then we can lag S by 12 months or 3 months. And you can imagine the sort of robustness that we can look at. The second thing, and I'll just show you this briefly, is that we can actually look, and this is, again, the benefit of having these sort of data, intertemporally at how network structure varies with migration decisions. So what this figure is showing is that for people who eventually migrate, this is sort of an event study where we pick the date of migration as month T, and we decompose their social network by home contacts, destination contacts, and non-home or destination contacts over time. And what we see here is that the majority of contacts are in home. There's a minority in the destination, but then after migration, the network structure changes pretty quickly. But what we don't see, except really in maybe the month or two prior to migration, is a marked shift in network structure prior to migration. And we look at this for higher order network structure too, and there's not really a lot of evidence that there are these strategic anticipatory changes in network structure. But again, this is not airtight. The second thing we're going to do is what one of our referees called the death by fixed effects identification strategy, where acknowledging that there are a lot of other factors that influence the migration decision, we're going to try and use fixed effects to hold those constant. So a lot of you may be worried about first order concerns like, well, certain destinations have certain amenities. Like if we're looking at the capital district of Kigali in Rwanda, there's going to be very high migration rates to Kigali, and there's going to be very different network structures in Kigali. Well, if we add a Kigali fixed effect, that might help take care of this. But then you might ask, well, what if we're worried about there being a specific relationship between, there might be a seasonal IJ difference where it's very common that people migrate from Huye to Kigali only in December, and that Huye Kigali social networks look a certain way 3 months before December. Well, we can address that by adding an origin destination month fixed effect. So, again, because we have so much data, we can add a lot of fixed effects that would really be impossible with traditional data sets. So we'll add individual fixed effects to account for the fact that certain individuals may be more likely to migrate ever. But because we have 48 observations per individual, we can look at within individual variation and say, does this individual's migration decisions correlate with changes in their network structure prior to migration? And then finally, and this is what Kaivan alluded to earlier, almost all of our analysis is not actually going to focus on how an individual's direct contacts correlate with their migration decision. We're going to look at how changes in the higher order structure of an individual's network correlate with migration decisions. In other words, when Kaivan's 3 friends in Oxford become more interconnected to each other, does that make Kaivan more likely to migrate to Oxford? Because arguably Kaivan has less control over the friendship network of his friends than he does over the people that he's directly connected to in the destination. So this is not about network size, it's about higher order structure. Okay, so that's enough. Let me sort of show you what the actual results look like. So this looks a lot like the figure I showed you earlier, where I'm looking at the correlation between migration rates and network size, except now I'm conditioning on all of those fixed effects that I mentioned previously. Home, destination, month, individual fixed effects. And then where it gets much more interesting is when we look at the higher order structure. So this equation has about 100 or about 1 million fixed effects, where what I'm showing you here now is the comparison that I showed you on that stylized slide earlier. So we're saying amongst people who have, I guess, exactly 15 contacts in the destination, are they more likely to migrate when their networks look like this relative to this? And the answer is yes. So all of these coefficients are positive. In other words, conditioning on the size of a network, you're always more likely to go to that destination when the people in that destination are more interconnected, but also that the effect is increasing. So the more contacts you have in the destination, the more important it is that they're interconnected. So that's sort of intuitive. But the one, I think, unintuitive result that I want to highlight is not this, but the next slide. But this is showing us looking instead of interconnections between individuals, it's sort of this comparison here. In other words, as your friends have more friends, if you have more friends of friends in the destination, how does that relate to the migration decision? And we see that the more friends of friends you have, the more likely you are to migrate. But, and this is maybe the one sort of interesting slide to take away from this 20 minutes, is conditioning on the exact number of friends you have, how much does the friends of friend matter? And what's really interesting is this region over here. In other words, for individuals who have exactly 10 friends in the destination, they're actually less likely to migrate to places where their friends have more friends. And this is like really counterintuitive, but it just shows up in the data. So what I'm showing you here is the sample of all of the people who have exactly 10 friends in the destination. The migrants are in the dark blue and the non-migrants are in the green. And what you see is that the people who don't migrate have actually more friends of friends. In other words, just in the raw data amongst people who have exactly 10 friends in the destination, you're more likely to migrate if you have fewer fewer friends of friends, which sort of contradicts a lot of what you'd see in these stylized network models of like diffusion centrality and network information. All right, so I realize I'm out of time. I'll skip some of this and just have one other slide where I'll put a little bit of a smorgasbord of what else is in the paper. A lot of the paper looks at why this friends of friends effect is negative or insignificant. I think two things intuitively that make sense is it may just be that people are unaware of the extent to which their friends have lots of friends in the destination. There's also a literature on sort of this rivalry hypothesis, which is that if you have one friend in the destination and you're considering migrating there, maybe you want their undivided attention. And so the fact that they have lots of additional friends might suggest that they might not actually be a great resource for you if you arrive in the destination. And let me sort of skip this as well. Just to summarize, the paper looks at what drives the decision to migrate, acknowledging that there are a lot of forces that drive this decision. What we try and do is hold those fixed and zero in on the role of certain types of higher order network structure. And the bottom line is our results suggest that at least in this stylized world of migrants caring about interconnected networks versus expansive networks, it's really the interconnected networks that dominate. And then at a higher level, I think that the bigger picture takeaway here is that there's a lot of new insights that can be gained from these new sources of data. And I won't go through this last slide, but this is really just to highlight that this is one example of dozens of papers that have come out over the last 10 years. I think particularly when you look at public health and COVID response, these sort of new data sets are being used all over the place to look at migration and mobility. But there's also an explosion in economics literature, particularly in looking at internal migration, and especially in looking at developing countries where other sources of data are much less reliable. Okay, thanks. And let me stop sharing my screen and hand it back to you, Kaivan.
Thank you very much, Josh and Maria Esther. So this was terrific. You guys certainly made up for whatever limitations I might have had on my presentation. You can see the difference in the presentation as well, the slides, right? It's a generational thing. I look like something from 1980. But anyway, that said, hopefully I had some material that was useful to the audience. We have, I think, about 4 minutes, and we have 6 questions. So you guys, I think what's nice is that it's very clear, who the questions are addressed to. And I think I saw a couple of questions. I'll just go over mine, very, very quickly. And then Maria Esther, you can take over, and then Josh, okay? So I'll try to do this like super fast. So the first question was this question about choosing between structural modeling and some kind of quasi experimental approach using some kind of policy as the shock. And I guess Josh was kind of making fun of me as well, but I guess I just want to make clear that my point was not that we should ignore causality and just start estimating structural model. Okay, I'm not at all from that school, and I'm not interested in estimating equilibrium structural models and etc. As I emphasized, you do want an exogenous source of variation. And just to be clear, for example, with the Chinese entrepreneurs, there were shocks. I mean, in the sense that there was, in the early 1990s, clearly a conscious government policy to allow, private enterprise. And then in the early 2000s, there was clearly this move by the Chinese government to join the WTO, and that's what generated the increase in exports. Now, it is also true that these are sort of aggregate shocks. And I think what people generally have in mind with this type of quasi-random or quasi-experimental analysis is that there is a sort of shock that affects some people and not others. And in a sense, we are getting at that by looking at interacting those shocks with these transitions with the birth county population density. Now, the point that I want to make is that if you're looking at dynamics, long-term dynamics as we do over 20 years, if you have a shock, you can look at the long-term dynamics, but at the end of the day, it's simply going to be some starting point. And I'm all for identification and everything, but all I want to say is that if you want to look at big questions, you might want to start with sort of major stylized facts, look at the economy level, it's almost micro macro. And it's not for everyone, but I think in any field, at the end of the day, we want to look at the micro stuff. But then we also want to start looking at the big picture and big questions at the same time. Okay, so that was my sort of answer to that. And in terms of the potential entrepreneurs, the way we define potential entrepreneurs is the number of people of a particular age in the population. So it's the men between the age of 25 and 40 at a particular point in time, which we get from the population census. So it's not 25 and 60, sorry. Maria, you should go ahead now. We have just a short time, so.
Yeah, so very quickly, I think my question is pretty much about how to, like the external validity of our results. And I think that in the sense that I think that our project provides some sort of, let's say, implications for, in general, when migrants lose access to foreign labor markets. Now, there are particular shocks, economic shocks, or more macro shocks in different economies that could, I think that we need to be careful when analyzing different countries. But I will say that in general, what we could say is that these negative shocks in migrant source countries could be experienced when migrants lose access. When we have these ties or these connections that are so strong between workers from one country that are living and sending remittances to their home countries, what happens when they lose access to those labor markets. So that's the thing that we can make general about our results. So that's all that I am going to say for sake of time. Thank you.
Cool. I'll try and be very quick also. So to Abdul Razak's question about how we identify people's locations, we do have a scanning algorithm. I'd refer you to the paper. We have actually another paper in PLOS One where we do a lot of validation to compare different approaches to measuring locations. And we used anytime locations, but we also have robustness where we look at just nighttime locations to avoid potential commuting biases. Bing-Ching, I think it's a good point. How do you define the value of K? It's sort of arbitrary. In our main analysis, we used 3 based on that figure I showed you that didn't look like there was a lot happening within 3 months. But I think the main lesson is to just try a bunch of values, and hopefully your results won't be too sensitive to that. And if they are, think about it carefully. Max has this question about weak ties. I think that's an interesting hypothesis. In the paper, we disaggregate the effect into what we'll call strong and weak ties. And we don't find qualitatively different patterns for either strong or weak ties, but it's not something that we looked into in too much detail. Simon's question is a little bit more big picture, so I won't be able to get into it in too much detail, but I think, yes, I think that's where this literature is headed, right? Like, we look at social networks and migration partly because those are the 2 things that we can observe very well in mobile phone data. The data are anonymized though, so we don't observe anything else about people like their labor market outcomes or the other things that you would really want to observe. So there are papers out there that are connecting like regional labor market outcomes to the phone data and that sort of thing. Some of the ones I had on that last slide about Pia Barwick and Buchel have that. And then there is also work, for instance, by Nick Sivanidis and Michael Gechter, where they're actually surveying people over the phone and eliciting some of the sort of questions that you might want to ask about how like refugees integrate, where it's sort of a combination. And the advantage of that is you can collect informed consent and then get a lot more information than you would if you just had anonymized data. The disadvantage, of course, is the logistics are a nightmare. So I think it's, it's wide open, but we're just starting to see that sort of work now. Thanks, Phil.
Excellent. I guess we're done with the session then. We're a couple minutes over, but it was terrific. Thank you, Maria Esther. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you to all of the participants for staying on. So see you guys later. I'm going to leave now. Yeah.
Great.
Thanks,
you, Kaivan, for hosting.
Yeah. Bye.
Thank you, Kaivan. Thank you. Bye.